Picture this. You're 12 years old, you've just lost your first permanent tooth, and your parents wake you up one morning to announce that tomorrow you'll marry a 40-year-old stranger who lives 3 days' journey away. There's no discussion, no options, no escape. Your childhood is officially over. And what comes next will make any modern nightmare about toxic relationships seem like a fairy tale. Welcome to medieval marriage, where until death do us part wasn't a romantic vow, but a terrifyingly realistic timeline that most didn't survive. Where love was a luxury only the dead could afford, and where the phrase happily ever after simply meant both spouses survived long enough to see their children grow up. If you're ready to uncover the brutal truth that your history classes conveniently left out, then brace yourself for a dive into this historical nightmare that will completely redefine your perspective on marriage. Before we continue exploring the horrors awaiting you, if this kind of chilling historical truth fascinates you as much as it does us, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any episodes of our most disturbing investigations. The reality of medieval child marriage was far more complex and sinister than any romantic movie or book led you to believe. We're talking about an institution that functioned as a business transaction where children were literally the currency of exchange. Girls especially were seen as investments that matured over time, assets that could be traded, sold, or bartered according to their family's economic and political needs. In medieval Europe, the legal age for marriage was shockingly low, 12 for girls and 14 for boys according to canon law. But here's the truly unsettling part. These weren't just laws written on dusty parchments that no one followed. They were actively enforced in celebrated norms. Parish records from the time are filled with marriages where brides were between 8 and 12 years old, and grooms could range from 15 to 60 years or older. Take the case of Margaret Beaufort, who was married for the first time at age 6 to John de la Pole. Although that marriage was annulled, she married again at 9 to Edmund Tudor, who was 24. Margaret became pregnant immediately and gave birth to her only child, the future King Henry VII, at just 13. The childbirth nearly killed her, and the physical and psychological traumas marked her for life. Her story wasn't a tragic exception. It was the expected norm for noble girls. But here's where it gets truly horrifying. The consummation of marriage wasn't always delayed until the girl reached puberty. Medieval medical records are filled with cases of girls dying from complications of early pregnancies, internal injuries caused by premature sexual relations, and fatal infections due to the lack of hygiene and basic medical knowledge. Doctors of the time recommended waiting until age 14 for consummation, but these recommendations were often ignored by impatient husbands and families eager to ensure the legitimacy of the union. Marriage preparation began practically from birth, especially for girls. From the age of 3 or 4, noble girls were sent to other households to learn domestic skills, courtly etiquette, and what was euphemistically called marital preparation. This preparation included explicit teachings about their sexual duties, techniques to please their future husbands, and methods to survive the repeated childbirths expected to produce male heirs. Engagement ceremonies often took place when girls were between 5 and 8 years old. These weren't joyful celebrations filled with sweets and games. They were solemn legal contracts where the girl, dressed as a miniature adult, swore fidelity to a man she likely didn't even know. Documents from the time describe girls crying during these ceremonies, comforted by mothers who knew exactly the fate awaiting them because they had experienced it themselves. The economic aspect was brutally transparent. Dowries weren't romantic gifts. They were meticulously calculated payments that included land, livestock, jewelry, cash, and trade rights. Families literally put a price on their daughters, and that price determined the kind of husband they could secure. An insufficient dowry could condemn a girl to marry someone socially or economically inferior, while a generous dowry could elevate her to the aristocracy, though not necessarily to happiness. Medieval marriage contracts were extraordinarily detailed legal documents that specified not only financial aspects, but also reproductive rights, sexual obligations, and penalties for noncompliance. Some contracts included clauses requiring the wife to produce a male heir within a specific time frame, with severe financial and social consequences if she failed to comply. Others specified the minimum frequency of sexual relations, prohibited contraceptive methods, and the circumstances under which the husband could seek an annulment. Domestic violence wasn't just tolerated, it was legally sanctioned and socially expected. Medieval laws explicitly established the husband's right to correct his wife using physical force as long as he didn't kill or permanently disable her. Marriage conduct manuals from the time included detailed instructions on how and when to beat a wife, which instruments to use, and how to avoid leaving visible marks that might cause social scandal. And here's another revelation that will chill your blood. The concept of marital rape simply didn't exist in the medieval legal framework. Once a girl was married, her body no longer legally belonged to her. Her husband had absolute rights over her, regardless of her age, health, or consent. Court records from the time are filled with cases of girls seeking legal protection from abusive husbands, only to be returned to their tormentors with the blessing of the church and the state. Infant mortality related to early marriages was alarmingly high, but these deaths were rarely officially attributed to child marriage. Instead, they were classified as female weakness, God's will, or delicate constitution. Girls who died in childbirth were posthumously praised for their noble sacrifice and marital devotion. Their deaths were romanticized as examples of feminine virtue, instead of being recognized as the avoidable tragedies they truly were. Medieval medical records reveal chilling details about the injuries and complications suffered by married girls. Pelvic fractures, internal lacerations. Chronic infections and severe psychological trauma were so common that doctors of the time developed specific treatments for what they called juvenile marital afflictions. These treatments included potions to calm marital hysteria, ointments for intimate injuries, and regular bloodletting to purify the blood corrupted by terror. Resistance to these marriages, though rare, existed and was brutally suppressed. Girls who tried to escape, reject their husbands, or simply express their unhappiness faced punishments ranging from solitary confinement to religious excommunication. Some were sent to convents as punishment, where they spent the rest of their lives in penance for their unnatural disobedience. Others were publicly beaten as an example to other girls who might consider resisting. If you thought this couldn't get worse, you were wrong. Many of these stories need a moment to process. And if you want to keep uncovering these perspective-shifting truths, make sure to subscribe, because we have plenty more disturbing revelations waiting for you. The psychological aspects of medieval child marriage were devastating in ways we're only beginning to understand. Girls who survived their marriages often developed what medieval medical records described as perpetual melancholy, marital hysteria, or weakness of spirit. These medieval terms likely described what we now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, severe depression, and chronic anxiety resulting from repeated sexual and psychological trauma. Medieval convents were filled with women who chose religious life after traumatic marital experiences. Many of these vocations were in fact forms of psychological escape, where traumatized women sought refuge in monastic life as the only alternative to continued marital abuse. The writings of some of these nuns reveal graphic descriptions of their marital experiences that would make a modern trauma psychologist blush. Girls' education was specifically designed to prepare them for marital submission. Medieval educational manuals included lessons on enduring physical pain without complaint, pleasing violent husbands, and finding spiritual purpose in earthly suffering. Girls were taught that their worth as individuals was directly tied to their ability to produce male heirs and keep their husbands satisfied regardless of the personal cost. The medieval church, far from protecting these girls, provided the ideological justification for their exploitation. Sunday sermons regularly emphasized that women were created specifically to serve men, that female suffering was part of the divine plan as punishment for Eve's original sin, and that resisting marriage was equivalent to resisting God's will. Priests blessed marriages between prepubescent girls and adult men with the same solemnity they applied to any other sacrament. Contraceptive methods were strictly forbidden for wives, though ironically they were tolerated for prostitutes. This meant that married girls were doomed to repeated pregnancies from the moment of consummation until death, while women in prostitution had access to methods to control their fertility. Medieval logic dictated that wives existed to reproduce while prostitutes existed for pleasure, creating a cruel paradox where respectable women had less control over their bodies than socially marginalized women. Records from some noble families reveal generational cycles of trauma, where mothers who had been married as girls perpetuated the system by marrying off their own daughters at equally young ages. These documents include letters where mothers described their pain at handing over their daughters, but also their resignation to a system they saw as unchangeable. Some mothers tried to delay their daughters' marriages or negotiate better terms, but these subtle resistances rarely achieved lasting success. Medieval medical documentation also reveals desperate attempts by some women to terminate unwanted pregnancies using extremely dangerous methods. Homemade abortive potions made from toxic herbs, diluted poisons, and corrosive substances killed as many women as the embryos they sought to eliminate. Doctors of the time recorded hundreds of deaths attributed to these desperate attempts, but rarely connected these tragedies to the marital conditions that motivated them. Class differences also created horrific variations in these experiences. While noble girls had at least some economic and social protection, peasant girls faced even harsher conditions. Peasant marriages often involved the girl working as agricultural labor, in addition to fulfilling her reproductive duties, creating a physical burden that was literally deadly for childlike bodies. Rural parish records show significantly higher rates of juvenile marital mortality among the working classes. The documentation of some specific cases provides details almost impossible to process emotionally. Isabel de Bermanduis was married at 8 to Count Roberto de Laer, who was 36. Court records describe how Isabel needed physical assistance to walk after the consummation of her marriage and developed a condition medieval doctors called perpetual night terror, which kept her awake for days on end. She died at 14 during her second childbirth, and her recorded last words were a plea that no girl should suffer as I suffered. The legal aspects were equally disturbing. Medieval marriage laws established that, once consummated, a marriage could not be dissolved under any circumstances except in cases of non-consummation or very close kinship. This meant that girls who survived abusive marriages were legally trapped for life, regardless of how severe the abuse was or how young they were when married. Ecclesiastical courts occasionally heard cases of extreme abuse, but annulments were extraordinarily rare and usually required significant political influence. The cruelest irony of this entire system was that it was justified as protection for women. Medieval theologians argued that early marriage protected girls from sexual temptation, kept them under proper male supervision, and provided them with economic security. This protectionist rhetoric masked a system that was fundamentally exploitative and treated girls as property to be transferred from father to husband as quickly and efficiently as possible. The few records we have of these girls' voices are devastating in their simplicity and despair. Letters, diaries, and court testimonies reveal thoughts like, I wish I had never been born a girl. I pray to God to take me before the next pregnancy and envy the nuns who never knew the terror of marriage. These voices preserved in dusty archives provide direct evidence of the systematic suffering that characterized these unions. So, there it is, the brutal and undeniable reality of medieval child marriage. Fully exposed a system that turned childhood into a commodity marriage, into a legalized form of abuse and motherhood, into a likely death sentence for girls who should have been playing with dolls, not being treated as human dolls by adult men. Now, as we process these chilling truths about our past, I want to know, where are you joining us from? Are you in Brazil, Portugal, Angola, Mozambique? Let us know in the comments which country you're following this journey through the darkest shadows of history from. And if you want to keep uncovering truths that textbooks prefer to hide, don't forget to subscribe, because between shadows and kings, we're only beginning to reveal the most disturbing secrets of the past.